Chapter 1. The Cradle of Monsters. The skies above Vinmara, 7 churned like a wounded beast, crimson and storm-racked, tearing themselves apart, with violent flashes of emerald lightning that forked across the horizon. The sun, if it could still be called that, hung low and sickly in the sky, a bloated orange sphere obscured behind layers of corrosive gas and debris from long-forgotten orbital skirmishes. Below it, the land lay in ruin. Spines of obsidian rock jutted from the blood-red soil like the ribs of a fallen titan, and lakes of bubbling sludge stretched between dead forests of petrified trees that whispered in the windless silence. It was a cursed place, rejected by cartographers and quarantined by the Galactic Accord, a place where exploration vessels avoided and supply drones flew around. They called it a death world, but that term was a mercy. There was life here, but it was cruel, old, and hungry. Among the fractured canyons near the equatorial range, hidden beneath a narrow overhang of razor shale, a small figure trembled in the shadows. Her skin was a dusky violet, mottled with bruises and burns, and her eyes wide, glassy, and luminous stared out into the black with a kind of haunted vacancy that spoke of both unimaginable pain and a longing too vast for words. She was small, barely the size of a human toddler, but her head was disproportionately large, her thin arms covered in a soft bioluminescent fuzz that once signified health in her species. Now it barely glowed. She had no name anymore, not one that meant anything to her, but in a former life, in a place where suns still shone and laughter existed, she had been called Ashy. Ashy had been abandoned. Not lost. Not forgotten. Deliberately abandoned. Her species, the Nyrian, were known throughout the Helix sectors as spiritual purists, masters of genetic aesthetics and philosophers of cosmic alignment. But beneath their serene exteriors lay a deep and quiet cruelty, a eugenic tradition that spanned hundreds of generations. Any deviation, any imperfection, even the smallest blemish or disorder, was considered a sign of disfavor from the stars. Ashy had been born small, underdeveloped, with a slight neurological divergence that caused her to cry often and speak slowly. Her mother had wept in silence for 3 days, knowing the consequence. And on the morning of the 4th, Ashy had been taken from her warmth, drugged into sleep, and placed aboard a drone skiff programmed to crash land on Vinmara 7. She woke to agony. Her small lungs choked on the sulfur-laced air, and her sensitive skin blistered beneath the alien light. Her cries went unanswered as the predators of the land circled, curious at first, then eager. For days how many she did not know. She crawled, hid, begged the stars for mercy in a language no one would ever hear again. Her voice cracked, her tears dried, and eventually, her cries grew quiet, not because the pain ended but because she no longer expected anyone to hear. She had learned to cover herself in mud to dull her scent, to hide beneath broken carapaces of dead creatures, to curl up in the crevices where the wind didn't reach. There was a time when she hoped the monsters would eat her and end it, but they never did. Some looked at her and passed by. One, an eyeless burrower, touched her face gently before returning to its den. That, somehow, was worse. When the human came, she was not awake. She was buried beneath layers of shale and moss, her breathing shallow, her light dimmed to almost nothing. He didn't come like a knight or a hero. He came with blood on his armor, limping, half delirious, his suit flickering with failing power reserves. His ship had crashed days earlier on the far ridge after a dogfight with pirate scavengers. He had wandered, following faint readings that might have been water or might have been an illusion. His name was Kieran Holt, a former engineering officer turned freighter captain, and he had expected to die here. In fact, part of him welcomed it. When his boots crunched over the shale, near her crevice, Ashy stirred weakly. It was not the sound that woke her, but the scent, cleaner, foreign, and strangely soft. Her eyes cracked open, unblinking. She expected another beast. Maybe the kind that dragged prey into the vents of the earth and fed for weeks. She didn't care. But what she saw was a tall figure collapsing onto his knees, his breath rasping against the inside of his shattered helmet. One eye swollen shut, his chest plate scarred and melting from a recent plasma strike. Kieran didn't see her at first. He thought the reading had come from some thermal exhaust. But when his suit's cracked sensor pinged a proximity warning, and when he turned, rifle drawn out of old instinct, he stopped cold. In the dark recess, his flashlight beam caught a pair of eyes huge, glistening, trembling with exhausted terror. Not a creature. Not some beast. A child. An alien girl. Barely alive. At first, he thought it a hallucination. His oxygen mix was compromised, his hydration systems leaking. But then she whimpered. A real, low, raw sound like a cracked music note struggling to exist. His gun dropped. He fell to one knee, breath catching in his throat, not from fear, but something deeper. Something primal. She was shaking. Her skin was cracked in places. Her tiny fingers curled over a bundle of frayed, moss-wrapped bone she clutched like a doll. He realized in that moment that he wasn't alone in dying. She expected him to leave. Maybe worse. Maybe shoot her, or take what little she had and move on. But instead, the human unhooked his last water pack, opened it carefully, and slid it toward her without a word. She didn't move at first. Her instincts screamed trap. But thirst overruled terror, and with great effort, she pulled the pouch close and sipped, then gulped. It hurt, but it was life. They sat there for hours. Neither spoke. He didn't try to touch her, didn't crowd her. Just stayed near. Breathing. Bleeding. Alive. When night fell and the monsters howled, he did something she never expected. He dragged himself closer, groaning in pain, and activated the low-frequency defense field embedded in his suit. A faint shimmer spread around them like a dome. It wasn't strong, but it would deter the larger predators. She slept that night. For the first time in what felt like forever, she slept without fear. In the morning, she watched him work. He broke apart his suit's forearm console and rewired it with pieces of salvaged drone tech. She didn't know what he was building, but his hands were precise. He didn't look at her often, but when he did, he didn't flinch, didn't sneer. He looked like someone who saw her as real, as someone worth saving. When he spoke, it was soft. We're gonna get off this rock, kid. You and me. Promise. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. And for the first time, Ashy reached out. Just a finger. Touched his boot lightly. It was enough. He worked until his fingers bled. Not because he thought he could repair the beacon completely that hope had burned out with his ship's last flare, but because doing something kept the silence at bay. It kept his mind from wandering to the possibility that no one was coming. The child watched, always from a few feet away, her massive eyes never blinking for too long. When he coughed, she flinched. When he cried out softly from a jolt of pain in his side where the cracked ribs still ached, she hugged herself tighter. But she never ran. She never tried to leave. There was something unspoken between them now, a tether that bound their lives together in the shadow of a world that wanted both of them dead. Kieran didn't ask her name at first. It felt wrong, like asking a ghost who it used to be. Instead, he gave her things. Little pieces of himself. A warm wrap torn from the inner lining of his survival kit. A tiny, flickering hologram projector that still played a blurry recording of his old ship. A harmonica damaged and sour tone that he played at night not because it sounded good, but because it reminded him that music could still exist in places like this. She didn't smile, not really, but once her eyes closed when he played, and he caught the softest sound escape her lips. It could have been a breath, could have been a hum, but it felt like trust. She was healing slowly. Her skin glowed again, faintly, like the last ember of a long-dead fire. He coaxed her to eat, first from his rations, then small fruits and stalks he found nearby poisoned to most species, but she took them gratefully. He saw her strength return in tiny things. How she climbed instead of crawled. How her fingers traced the holograms he showed her, fascinated by the stars she'd never see. Kieran began to realize something unbearable. She was smart. Not just alive. She noticed things he didn't. She pointed to tracks that meant predators nearby. She pressed buttons on his interface and tilted her head when the signal changed. She wasn't a burden. She was learning, and she had been left here. By her own kind. The thought made him angrier than he'd ever expected. Not the burning anger of betrayal or vengeance, but the cold, sick kind. The kind that grew when you saw a child who should have been loved, should have been protected, instead thrown to monsters by people who wore the mask of culture and purity. She had been unwanted, but she was his now. Chapter 2. What Monsters Fear. They moved out at dawn on the 5th day. Kieran had found the partial wreckage of another ship's escape pod a few kilometers away older, but intact enough that its emergency transponder might still hold some charge. He couldn't carry her, not with his injuries, and she couldn't keep pace with his long strides. So he built a sling. It wasn't elegant, woven from a harness strap, carbon cabling, and an old fabric panel, but it let her rest against his back, arms hooked around his neck as they journeyed across terrain that was alive with death. Vinmara, 7 didn't allow progress easily. Even walking was war. The cracked ground shifted unexpectedly. Burrowers boiled up from nests beneath stone crusts, and acidic mist rolled in like low tide, stinging flesh and corroding metal. But they moved anyway, together, because stopping meant dying, and neither of them was ready to let go. The monsters came at night. Not just the creatures, though there were many, clawed and shrieking and ancient, but something else. A presence. A rhythm in the earth that neither of them could explain. Kieran would set up a perimeter with motion-triggered shock traps, burying the emitters in the sand, while the girl huddled beneath the heat tarp. But always, just before midnight, something would circle them. The traps never caught it. The scanners never read it. But both of them felt it. She was the first to speak then. A whisper. A single word. Yrel. He turned. That you? Your name. She shook her head. No. Monster. He crouched down, met her eyes. Tell me. She reached out, touching his wrist gently, and pointed to the sky, then down into the ground, then into her own chest. Yrel. It watches. It listens. Kieran didn't know the word. He'd heard of no such thing in the planetary logs. But he believed her. He had to. Because on that third night, when he woke to silence, true, complete silence, he saw something in the fog. A shape, impossibly tall, moving like a shadow against a darker sky. No sound. No roar. But the air trembled around it, as if reality was uncomfortable in its presence. It didn't attack. It just watched. He clutched his weapon. The girl hid behind him, clutching his leg. For 1 minute, the three of them were frozen in time, man, child, and monster. Then it vanished. She whispered the word again. Yrel. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. Not because of fear, but because in that moment, he realized something terrifying. The monsters of Vinmara, 7 weren't hunting them. They were afraid of her. The path to the wrecked escape pod grew more treacherous with each step. The red soil hardened into brittle, glassy crusts that splintered beneath Kieran's boots, sometimes giving way entirely to exposed deep, jagged sinkholes choked with fog. The air was heavier now, thick with the scent of ash and electricity, like a storm about to break. Even the girl who had grown steadier, more alert in recent days, kept her head low, her grip tighter around Kieran's shoulders as though she, too, could feel something building beneath the surface. Not just danger. Not just another beast. Something vast and awake. Kieran didn't speak. He saved his breath, moving quickly, methodically, forcing his body to keep up even as pain bloomed with each step from the fracture in his side. The signal from the pod was faint but real, and he had calibrated his wrist scanner to follow its pulsing tone. They were close, less than 2 kilometers now, but distance meant nothing on Vinmara, 7. A single ridge could be crawling with creatures. One wrong step could trigger a collapse or worse, announce their presence to whatever still hunted them from the silence. As they crossed a narrow ridge of crumbled rock, Kieran slowed, crouching low. The girl leaned her cheek against the back of his neck, and he could feel her breathing fast, her small heart racing against his spine. Something was wrong. The valley below, where the pod's wreckage should have been, was scorched black. Not burn-scorched. The ground had melted in jagged rings, like a plasma weapon had carved symbols into the terrain from orbit. And in the center of it all sat the pod, half-melted, tilted on its side like a broken egg, steaming faintly in the red light. Around it, there were no creatures. No sounds. Not even insects. Just an eerie stillness that made Kieran's mouth go dry. She's here, the girl whispered. He turned, startled. Who? The girl raised her arm slowly, pointing toward the far edge of the crater. And then he saw it. Not the Yrel, not the towering phantom that haunted their nights, but something else entirely. A figure. Humanoid, but impossibly tall, cloaked in robes that flickered like the surface of water seen through heat. It stood motionless, facing the wreck, arms folded in front of its body, as if in mourning. Kieran's breath caught in his throat. His scanner showed nothing. No heat signature. No mass. But his eyes didn't lie. The girl crawled down from the sling, her bare feet touching the cracked earth with reverence, and began to walk toward the figure. Kieran reached out instinctively. Wait dash. But she didn't look back. Her tiny feet carried her with a grace he hadn't seen in her before, like she was being drawn forward by a memory or a song only she could hear. The moment her foot crossed the melted threshold of the crater, the figure turned just slightly. It didn't speak. It didn't move. But in that instant, Kieran felt something like gravity shift. Like the ground itself had recognized her. The girl stopped. Her voice trembled. Mother! Kieran's jaw clenched. He took a step forward, but the air turned solid, like a wall of pressure wrapped around him. The girl continued. You left me here, she whispered. But I didn't die. The figure rippled in the light. And then without a word it vanished. Simply ceased to exist, like mist scattered by a sudden wind. Silence returned. The girl fell to her knees. Not crying. Not angry. Just still. As if a part of her that had been frozen had finally broken free. Kieran rushed to her, dropped beside her, and held her shoulders. What happened? She looked up at him, eyes wide. She came to see if I was dead. His heart sank. Your mother? She nodded. He wrapped her in his arms, pulling her close. She didn't resist this time. She didn't flinch. She leaned into him, her thin arms wrapping around his chest, her voice barely audible. But I wasn't. You found me first. The escape pod was unsalvageable. Whatever had happened in that crater hadn't merely scorched its systems, it had unraveled them. The interior was warped and partially fused, as if heat alone couldn't account for the damage. No normal plasma strike would bend hull metal into curves like folded paper. Kieran climbed inside anyway, gently placing the girl on a cushion of thermal insulation while he sifted through scorched panels and warped electronics, hoping that some shard of function remained, some power cell, some undamaged relay. She sat quietly now. Her face was expressionless, but Kieran could tell something within her had shifted. She wasn't cold. She wasn't detached. It was more like a cord had snapped inside her, something old and painful, and she had simply let it fall away. Her eyes wandered as he worked, landing on melted console frames and half-burnt straps. There were signs that the pod hadn't landed alone. Other smaller burn marks surrounded it. Perhaps this was once a place where others were sent. Perhaps she hadn't been the only child discarded. Kieran exhaled through gritted teeth as another panel snapped in his hands. Dead, he muttered. All of it. Then a soft tone chimed like a heartbeat coming back after cardiac arrest. The internal transponder hadn't survived, but the emergency beacon deep in the belly of the escape pod had just pulsed once. A weak signature, but a real one. He dropped to his knees, fingers working fast. Come on, stay with me, he hissed, rewiring what he could with strands of melted alloy. The beacon flickered again. He opened his comms and pushed it. One ping. Another. Long pauses between. But there it was, a weak but traceable signal. A breadcrumb in the dark. He turned to her, blinking. We have a chance. Someone might hear this. She looked at him, her small face unreadable for a long beat. Then she nodded. Just once. That was enough. That night, they camped under the broken canopy of the pod. He shared the last of his heat packs with her. As the wind howled through the crater and the sound of distant beasts rose from the ravines, Kieran held his weapon across his chest, watching the mists. The girl leaned against him again, not because she was afraid, but because she had chosen to. Chapter 3, The Sky Answers. The message was heard. Far above Vinmara, 7, in the cold reaches of orbit, a relay station designed only for emergency transmissions caught the faint signal as it danced between dead satellites and space debris. It wasn't much. The beacon was flickering, bouncing chaotically through atmospheric static and magnetized winds, but it was real. A human distress code, outdated but unmistakable, was flagged and rerouted through 3 AI filters before reaching the central dispatch for the Colonial Responder Network. A scout vessel CSV Halo's wake received the emergency alert and altered course immediately. The ship's crew were hardened veterans, scavengers turned rescue officers, the kind of people who had seen too much and still answered the call. Their ship was fast, durable, and quiet, with a drop team trained to enter hostile environments. When they read the planet name on the manifest, most of them flinched. Vinmara, 7 was blacklisted for a reason. But the captain, a broad-shouldered woman named Varen Holt, Kieran's sister, recognized the signature in the code. And her blood turned to ice. Back on the surface, Kieran didn't know a rescue was coming. He didn't let himself believe in such things anymore. He moved as if no help would arrive repairing the shock emitter, scavenging toxin filter moss from the canyon walls, building signal reflectors out of his own suit's plated armor. The girl helped him. She didn't ask what they were building. She didn't need to. Her hands were small, but steady. She held wires as he soldered. She carved symbols on the rocks around their shelter, not words. Just marks she said the monsters didn't like. The Yral hadn't returned, but they both knew it watched. The days blurred together. They ate what they could find. They built traps. They grew quiet and strong and watchful. Then, one afternoon, the sky changed. The clouds split not naturally, but surgically as a sleek black rescue craft broke atmosphere like a spear through glass. Its engines thundered across the canyons, shaking stones from cliffs, sending flocks of insectoid scavengers screaming into the air. Kieran looked up, heart hammering. The girl shielded her eyes, squinting, her expression unreadable. He didn't wait. He fired a flare, his last one, jerry-rigged with a chemical burn so bright it lit the crater like daylight. The ship curved, banking, and circled once before beginning its descent. When the ramp lowered and armed rescuers spilled out, Kieran dropped to his knees, not in weakness, but in sheer disbelief. The woman at the front of the team froze as she saw him. "Kieran," she whispered. He nodded. "Hey sis, took you long enough." Then he turned to the little alien girl at his side, who now gripped his hand with both of hers. "I found someone," he said. And for the first time, she stepped forward on her own, unshielded, unhidden, and faced the humans unafraid. The wind kicked up in great gusts as the halo's wake set down in the crater, displacing clouds of ash and fine dust that spiraled into the air like phantoms being exorcised from the earth. The girl flinched only slightly, her grip on Kieran's hand firm, her small body braced against the blast with an instinct that was not born of training but of adaptation. She had learned to survive Venmara 7's tantrums, and now, something louder, larger, brighter had come. Her eyes, enormous and glinting with nerves, fixed on the figures descending the landing ramp. Humans, armored and alert, weapons slung at their sides but not raised. They moved with discipline and caution, fanning out around the pod's perimeter as their visors scanned and mapped the crater in real time. But the one at the center, the tall woman with scars across her jaw and fire in her step, was different. Varen Holt didn't look at the terrain or the ruined escape pod. She only looked at her brother. Kieran rose slowly, the ache in his ribs radiating with every movement, but he never let go of the girl's hand. Her fingers were wrapped around his like wire, and he understood her fear. He was the first and only being she had known who hadn't hurt her, and now strangers had come from the sky fast, powerful, and unknown. Her body trembled not from weakness, but from the anticipation of judgment. She had seen it in others. She had lived it. Varen strode forward, her helmet removed and tucked under one arm. Her expression was unreadable, halfway between awe and fury. She stopped 2 paces from Kieran and stared at the girl. "You didn't say you had a kid," she said softly. "I didn't," Kieran replied, voice dry and hoarse. "I found her." Varen's eyes dropped to the child's face, taking in the violet skin, the strange bone ridges along her temples, the faint bioluminescent glow pulsing weakly beneath her bruised chest. She looked nothing like them. She was alien literally and visibly. But what held Varen in place wasn't her alienness. It was the way she stood beside Kieran. The way she held herself, chin tilted just slightly upward in defiance despite her obvious fear. She looked like a child who had learned to walk through hell and still dared to hope for something better. One of the soldiers behind Varen whispered, "That's Nyrian. What's she doing here?" "She was left," Kieran said. "Left to die? I don't care who she was born to. I'm not leaving her behind." Varen's jaw worked. Her eyes flicked between the child, the wreckage, and her brother, bleeding, burned, held together with patches and grit. In her years of command, she had seen cruelty in every form. But this, the Nyrian were supposed to be advanced, peaceful, evolved. This was barbarism. "She yours now?" she asked, tone blunt. Kieran looked down at the girl, who looked up at him, waiting for the answer. Her fingers tightened just a fraction. "Yeah," he said. "She's mine." There was a pause, brief, heavy. Then Varen nodded once. "Then she gets evac priority. Med team now? I want full scans, biocompat checks, and no damn questions." If anyone so much as looks at her sideways, they answer to me. The girl didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She watched as humans moved quickly, now one wrapping a heat blanket around her, another checking her vitals. She stiffened, eyes darting to Kieran. He gave her a single nod. "It's okay," he whispered. "They're with me." That was enough. She let them guide her. She didn't cry. She didn't hide. Inside the halo's wake, she sat beside Kieran in the med bay, her little feet dangling off the edge of the table, swinging slightly. Her gaze wandered around the sterile white interior, the glowing screens, the unfamiliar smells. But her hand never left his. Not once. And when the medic asked Kieran what her name was, he paused for a long moment. Then he looked at her and asked gently, "Do you remember what they used to call you?" She was quiet. Then, for the first time, she answered in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Ashi." Kieran smiled. "Then that's your name." The ship's engines rumbled gently as it left the poisonous skies of Vinmara 7 behind. The cloud barrier, once suffocating and endless, broke open into a field of stars so blindingly vast and brilliant that Ashi recoiled at first, instinctively clutching the blanket to her chest. She had never seen stars like that, never seen the cosmos in motion, fluid and endless. Her world had been confined to jagged rocks, monsters, and a sky that never showed anything but pain. Now, there was silence. Clean, breathable air. Smooth floors that didn't shift beneath her. Gentle lighting that dimmed with her presence instead of flaring violently. The humans on the ship, the ones in uniform, the ones who spoke in clipped voices, watched her carefully, most of them with curiosity, some with discomfort, none with cruelty. She didn't speak to them. She didn't need to. She stayed near Kieran, rarely more than an arm's length away, until the ship entered its second sleep cycle and the hum of crew footsteps faded into quiet. That night, if it could still be called night, Kieran sat awake in the crew quarters, staring through the observation window, while Ashi lay curled beside him in a thermal sling. She was exhausted, but she refused to sleep alone. He didn't push her. He just stayed, watching the stars scroll by. His ribs still ached. His hands were raw. But for the first time in days, maybe weeks, his breathing was even. Varen joined him hours later. She didn't say anything at first. She just leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching the girl sleep. "She's not what I expected," she finally said. "What did you expect?" Kieran asked. "I don't know. Something more. Alien. Dangerous. Cold." He nodded slowly. They left her there because she was small. Because she wasn't perfect. Varen clenched her jaw. "That's not imperfection. That's evolution telling the rest of us to grow up." They watched Ashi for another long moment. Her breathing was shallow, but peaceful now. Her small fingers gripped the edge of the blanket like it was a lifeline. "Do you know what comes next?" Varen asked. "No," Kieran said honestly. "But I know she's not going back. And I'm not letting anyone take her away. I figured." Varen smiled slightly. "Good. Then I'll make sure nobody tries." And in that quiet, between two soldiers and one child, a future began to form, uncertain, but real. Chapter 4, A Name in the Stars. Weeks passed. Ashi healed. Her skin grew luminous again, glowing faintly when she slept. Her wounds, internal and external, began to close, though scars remained along her legs and near her spine, a cruel reminder of the world that had tried to unmake her. The medics were gentle, but baffled. Nyrian physiology was rare, and their records of the species were incomplete. Yet Ashi responded well to treatment, especially when Kieran remained in the room, his calm presence the only sedative she seemed to trust. She began to speak more, not in full sentences, not yet, but in steady, deliberate words. She called Kieran Kier, shortening his name to something that fit the rhythm of her own tongue. When he left the room, she waited by the door. When he returned, her face lit up, not with a smile, but with recognition, with trust, with something approaching the warmth of childhood long suppressed. She asked questions. She pointed at star maps and blinking screens. She traced patterns in the condensation on the windows. She was beginning to learn that the universe extended beyond cruelty. But outside the halo's wake, the galaxy moved on. News of the Nyrian practice of abandoning imperfect children began to circulate among diplomatic circles after Varen filed a classified report. She didn't name Ashi. She never would. But her words reached the ears of people who were not so easily silenced. Cultural protections fell under scrutiny. The Nyrian ambassador issued a vague denial cloaked in elegance. But others had heard enough. Whispers spread of a forgotten caste, of other children, of a quiet extermination disguised as spiritual doctrine. Back aboard the ship, none of this touched Ashy directly. She didn't understand, yet the firestorm building beyond the hull. But Kieran did, and Varen did. They knew that eventually, someone would come perhaps to reclaim her, or worse, to erase the evidence. But they also knew something else. They wouldn't let that happen. On the morning they docked at Calderon Station, Ashy stood at the viewport in her new clothes stitched from Kevlar fiber fabric, softened by weeks of wear. She stood with Kieran beside her, watching the sun rise over the massive, rotating ring of the station. She leaned into him and whispered, "Home." He looked at her, thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Yeah, if you want it to be." Later that day, when the intake officer asked for her full name to enter her into the station registry, Ashy stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Ashy Holt." Kieran blinked. He hadn't suggested it. He hadn't planned it. She had chosen it on her own. And that night, as stars poured across the station sky like slow rivers of light, the name Ashy Holt was etched into the registry of Earth-aligned civilian protections, filed not under species, but under status, dependent, rescued. Not an experiment, not an orphan, a survivor, a daughter. The weeks that followed Ashy's registry were filled with quiet, deliberate beginnings. Not all things healed at once. There were days she still refused to be touched by anyone but Kieran. Nights she would jolt awake at phantom sounds and crawl into his arms in silence, her glowing skin trembling as memories clawed back from the void. But there were also better days. Days when she laughed not often, not loud, but true. Days when she sat with the station's botany crew, fascinated by plants that didn't bite or sting. She'd kneel in the soil, fingers gently brushing leaves, whispering names to things no one else could hear. She didn't ask about the Nyrian. She never spoke of her mother again. Kieran understood. He didn't bring it up. He didn't ask her to explain things that had almost broken her. Instead, he gave her space to grow not fast, not according to anyone's timetable, but her own. He was no father in the traditional sense, no trained caretaker. But he was steady. His world now revolved around her orbit. He found cargo work that let him stay close to the station, fixing broken engines and reprogramming drones while Ashy took classes with the younger station children. Sometimes she spoke in words they didn't know. Sometimes they laughed at her strange cadence or her moments of stillness. But one by one, they stopped laughing. Because Ashy watched. Ashy listened. And when she chose to speak, she said things that made even the adults pause. She was different, yes, but not small, not broken, not discardable. Word of her survival eventually reached the fringes of the Helix sectors. Nyrian vessels appeared quietly in the systems nearby, not in war, but in search. They wanted her back. They wanted to contain the story. But they were too late. Ashy was no longer an orphan hiding beneath bones in the dirt. She was documented, protected, loved. One particular envoy, polished, silver-eyed, wearing the robes of a high lineage, requested a private audience with Ashy and Kieran. Varen, now station security chief, stood at Kieran's side during the meeting. The envoy spoke in riddles, in apologies that were not apologies, in tones that circled guilt without naming it. When they offered repatriation, Ashy simply tilted her head and said, "I wasn't broken. You were." The envoy left quietly. Afterward, Varen asked her where she had learned those words. Ashy just smiled. "Kier says that sometimes." Kieran ruffled her hair gently. "Not anymore. You say them better." Years passed. Ashy grew tall. Her body grew stronger, her voice firmer, her bioluminescence no longer flickering weakly but pulsing with calm, radiant color that shifted with her mood. She studied xenobiology, diplomacy, and ancient languages. She learned how to fly. And on the eve of her 15th Earth year, she stood again at the station's glass dome with Kieran, looking out at the stars. "There are more," she said quietly. "Others like me. Still out there." Kieran nodded. "Yeah. I want to find them." He smiled. "I figured you would." She turned to him, serious. "Will you come with me?" He paused. "Always." And so began a new journey. A new ship. A new mission, not of war or survival, but of reclamation. Of finding the lost. Of pulling others out from the jaws of darkness. From under the claws of monsters. Because Ashley Holt had once been left to die among monsters. Now she was the reason others would live. Ashley Holt's name began appearing in places no one expected. Not in headlines or political manifestos, those would come much later, but in quiet corners of the galaxy, where refugees whispered stories to their children, where forgotten outposts passed coded signals across trade lanes, where abandoned souls learned to hope again. The name didn't spread with fanfare. It spread like fire under dry earth, quiet, persistent, unstoppable. Her first act wasn't revenge. It was mercy. When a derelict ship carrying other discarded Nyrian younglings was found floating near the edge of the Carmen the Nebula, its crew starved, and its power reserves blinking their last, Ashley insisted they be brought aboard. She cleaned their faces herself. She wrapped them in warm cloth, not armor. She spoke to them in their own forgotten cadence, slow and deliberate, the way her human father had once spoken to her. She told them stories about stars that didn't scream and people who didn't abandon the weak. And when they asked her, "What are we now?" she answered without hesitation, "You are ours. You are enough." Kieran stood behind her, older now, grayer around the temples, but no less fierce. He watched her become the voice he never thought he could be. She had found her power not through vengeance, not through a sword, but through the simple, terrifying choice to stay kind in a galaxy that had given her every excuse to grow cruel. She and Kieran built a new vessel. Its hull was patched together from scavenged fleets, its engines humming with harmonized power cells. They called it the Quiet Light. It wasn't fast. It wasn't beautiful, but it was impossible to ignore. It flew into places no other ship dared go, old slave markets, forgotten satellites, war-torn moons. Each time, Ashley walked out first, glowing faintly, her head high. She never raised a weapon. She didn't need to. Because by then, her story had become prophecy. To some, she was a myth. To others, a symbol. To the frightened child hidden under a burned-out reactor dome, she was salvation in the form of a girl who had once been just as small and just as scared. And to Kieran, she was simply his daughter. Years passed. One day, as the Quiet Light passed near the old orbit of Vinmara 7, Ashley stood alone on the observation deck. The world below still writhed with crimson clouds and buried monsters, unchanged, unforgiven. But she didn't hate it. Not anymore. That world had taken everything from her, but it had also led her to him. She whispered, as if the planet might still be listening. "I live." She turned away. Kieran waited for her in the bridge, seated in the old pilot's chair. She slipped into the seat beside him. Their hands, scarred and mismatched, brushed gently. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Always." And so, with no thunder, no final battle, no triumphant overture, only the soft hum of engines and the quiet glow of stars, the ship turned from the past, charted a course toward the unknown, and slipped into the dark, carrying a light that would never go out.